Well, I became aware of the entrance of the Red Army into the Polish territory on the 17th of September 1939. I was walking with a group of chance companions along a railroad track south of Pinsk in the vicinity of Sarny. It was mid-afternoon, and we decided to rest under a haystack. And as we were resting, we heard the buzzing of airplanes, of heavy airplanes. One of the fellows remarked, well, the British must be coming to our aid. And then when the planes flew over us, we looked up and we saw the red stars on their wings. So we realized that without declaring the war on Poland, the Soviet Union simply entered the country.
The external tail I like coming out. Is there a red light over here? Red light?
Not in the front.
Okay, we are going to record. The machine is running. We're getting a video level on the recorder's podium. But now everything doesn't work. Because we could do. Oh, I should have. Okay.
We became aware about the Katyń affair toward the middle of April 1943. We were curious to know what happened to one of my uncles, and he was taken prisoner by the Red Army in Tarnopol in October 1940, when the officers and the enlisted men of the Polish army were told to report to the commandant, Soviet commandant of the city. Of course, some people did not report. However, he and many others did report. They were arrested, packed into cattle cars, and shipped off to prisoner of war camps. And we, at that time, lived in Lviv, and we corresponded with him, and we knew that he was in the camp in Starobielsk. Now, there were 3 major prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union, containing Polish officers and enlisted men and non-commissioned officers, and then members of the police force and the border guards, and even civilians who worked for the government. Now, we corresponded with that uncle through part of 1940. Actually, I remember quite well that the last letter from him was dated April 10, 1940. Well, of course, later on we were taken to labor camps, and there was no way of corresponding with him. And after the amnesty of the Polish exiles and prisoners in the Soviet Union, following the agreement between the government in exile at that time in London and the Soviet government, which agreement was signed, I believe, the 30th of July 1941. When we were all released, we immediately started writing to the headquarters of the Polish army, which was being formed at that time in the Soviet Union, requesting information about that uncle. He was a reserve officer, a lieutenant in the medical corps. After quite some time, it was, I would say, around the after the middle of the summer of 1942, when we received an answer from the headquarters of the Polish army in the southern part of the Soviet Union at that time, in Buzowuk, that many of the officers, especially the officers from the camps in Starobielsk and Ostashkov, were shipped north to an island. I don't remember the name of that island. I think it was called New Earth, if I'm not mistaken. And they were shipped there, and since it was in the far north, the only possibility for them to come would be in August, in July and August of that particular year, and the headquarters expected an influx of officers from those camps at that time. Well, it turned out that those officers never came, never reported to the army. The army, under the command of General Anders, left the Soviet Union in the summer of 1942, and through Iran and the Middle East ended up as the Second Polish Corps fighting in Italy, in Monte Cassino, and so on. So, but in that April of 1943, we knew that the Germans found mass graves of Polish officers, over 4,000 of them, in a forest near Smolensk, the Katyń forest. And the indications were, and we were somehow pretty sure about it, that the massacre was performed by the Soviet security troops. The method of killing the officers was with a single bullet in the back of the head. Many people dismissed this thing as a German propaganda. However, at that time, in 1943, the end of 1943, we were involved or worked in a home for Polish invalids and orphans. The home was supported in part by the Polish embassy. There were many homes like that throughout the Soviet Union. My uncle, I was with his family at that time, family consisting of the uncle, his wife, and my cousin. He was the director of the home. So on several occasions he had to travel to the Polish embassy, which at that time was in Kujbyszew, to secure food transports, clothing, and so on, which was sent for the exiles in the Soviet Union, was sent from England. And while in the embassy in Kujbyszew, he was advised not to walk in the city because the secret police used to pick up the Poles of the streets. So he spent those days, sometimes up to a week, on the premises of the embassy and had the opportunity to read all kinds of transcripts, among them the transcripts of the conversations which General Sikorski, the prime minister of the government in exile, had with Stalin and Molotov in the presence of General Anders, the commander of the Polish army in the Soviet Union. And every time the generals asked about the Polish officers, and they had with them lists of those officers, because General Anders knew many of them and was sure that they should be somewhere in the Soviet Union. And there was a whole department which was charged with finding those officers, a department at the headquarters of the Polish army. Every time they asked Stalin and Molotov about the officers, the topic of the conversation was changed. At one point, when General Sikorski was visiting Moscow in December 1941, Stalin replied that all of the officers were released from camps. Well, the general said that they didn't report to the army. So Stalin said, well, maybe they just escaped through the far eastern border of the Soviet Union. When they insisted, no, that they just couldn't escape because it was too cold and too far and so on, and certainly not 11,000 people, Stalin picked up the phone and called up someone, asked about, did we release all of the Polish officers? There was some answer, and Stalin hung up and changed the topic of conversation. So obviously there was something not quite right in that whole situation. Germans brought in an international commission and so on, and the pathologists indicated that the murders were committed around the time of, let's say, April-May 1940. Now, when the Soviets reoccupied that territory, they brought in their own commission, which came to the conclusion that the murders were committed after the territory was occupied by the German troops. The story of Katyń is coming out. And of course now, and we have February of 1989, the story of Katyń is again coming out, and it's coming out in the Polish press, and there is even a commission, a bilateral Soviet-Polish commission, which is supposed to investigate the records that exist of that massacre. Of course, the real records should be in the archives of the Soviet NKVD, and it's not certain that anybody will be able to get their hands on them. After the war,
German invasion in 1941, Polish people and Russian people, because sometimes the Russian people were happy also because they thought that they can get rid of Stalin and communist system. So can we take it now? Okay, you can already. No.
Let me just concentrate a little bit. All right.
What do you think about the tape? We have about 10 minutes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
When the Germans occupied or started the war with the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the reaction of the Polish exiles was one of hope. Everybody hoped that now they will murder each other, and of course, which would be to the benefit of Poland. The reactions of the Russians was, well, many of them were stunned. They couldn't believe that the Germans, who were their friends for 2 years, all of a sudden turned on them. As the German army advanced east very rapidly, many of the Soviet citizens, particularly the peasants, hoped that when the Germans will occupy their territory, they will get rid of the collective farms. All of the Russian peasants were in collective farms, either state farms or collective farms. And they hoped that those things would be disbanded as soon as the Germans established their authority over the conquered territories. Well, the Germans didn't do it. And this contributed to a very large extent to the resistance, the underground resistance and the guerrilla or the partisan movement on the part of the Soviet population. The Germans didn't disband these collective farms because that was the best arrangement for collecting taxes, whether in food, in products, in produce, in nature, in animals, or in money. Just the most efficient way to collect taxes. The perception that the Russians had about the West were rather interesting. We encountered their attitudes after they occupied the Polish territories, and for example, their feeling was, or their perception was, that the...
You're going to have to hold the microphone.
Oh, okay. Should I start from the beginning? All right. The perception that the Soviet people had about the West were rather interesting and, to us, very amusing. For example, they believed that the workers in the West were maltreated, and that the capitalists were almost riding them. In Poland, the situation, or their thoughts about Poland, were that there were only big landowners, and those were, they were again maltreating the peasants and the workers. And they thought that their coming into Poland really liberated those people, and that those people would be very happy, where they weren't, because very soon they realized with whom they are dealing. Whenever we talk to them and ask them about the situation in the Soviet Union, do you have this or do you have that, they always had everything. And not only they had it, but they had it tremendous amounts of whatever we ask about. And finally we started joking about those things. For example, once we asked a Russian officer, a Soviet officer, do you have oranges in the Soviet Union? And he said, well, yes, we do. And as a matter of fact, next month we are opening a big factory which will manufacture oranges. They were totally unaware of, for example, how a toilet functions. And I remember that was with some friends of ours who, they were young people who occupied an apartment, rather large apartment, of a merchant who escaped to Romania. And there were several young people who lived there, a few couples, and one of the rooms was requisitioned by the army. That was in Lviv. And in that room there was a young Air Force lieutenant with his wife. And those friends of ours noticed that every morning before the lieutenant went to the field, to the airfield, he would lock himself up with his wife in the toilet. They would spend a few minutes there, and then they would come out, and he would go to work, and she would stay home. So one of the guys decided to see what they are doing there, and fortunately there was a transom over the door. So when they went and locked the door, he peeked in, and it turned out that the wife was using the toilet, except that she was standing on the bowl. And since, of course, the rims of the bowl are round and porcelain, consequently slippery, so the lieutenant, the husband, was holding her up. She was not used. She didn't know that you use the toilet sitting. It was only by squatting. And of course, this we encountered when we were in the camp and in the collective farm. And even in the cities, I went once to Kujbyszew, or twice, and stayed with some people I knew. And you had something that looked like an outhouse, except that it was inside, but it was a hole which everything dropped down to the ground, no matter what the floor was. Fortunately, they did not have skyscrapers. The Soviet troops that came to, quote, liberate the Western Ukraine and the Western White Russia were really a bunch of hicks. And even the officers' wives were probably simply just out of the village.
Okay, another problem.
The Soviet troops that came to liberate, quote unquote, the Western Ukraine and Western White Russia were a real bunch of hicks. And the officers' wives, for example, were convinced that nightgowns were evening gowns. So I remember going to the concert. It was a violinist, a young kid. Well, at that time he was probably, maybe 16 or so, but he came in short pants to look like a little kid, a wunderkind. And there was a bunch of course, of officers with their wives, and all of the wives wore nightgowns because they thought that those were evening gowns which you put on going to a theater or a symphony or an opera. They were not used to our toilets. And I remember an officer, probably a colonel or a lieutenant colonel, the equivalent rank, because at that time they didn't have the ranks of colonel and the usual military ranks, because that was a, quote, democratic army, and they just had some kind of names, but not the titles. At any rate, this officer complained to me. He says, you have very strange wash basins in your washrooms. He says, you have to pull the chain all the time in order to have the water running. Well, what happened was that at that time in Poland, the water tanks were under the ceiling, and there was a long chain, and if one wanted to flush the toilet, well, you just pulled on that chain, and the water came from the tank and flushed the toilet. And he used the toilet as a wash bowl. So no wonder it was uncomfortable, it was inconvenient. Well, as we all know, there was no freedom of religion in the Soviet Union unless it was sanctioned by the government. And it so happened, it was well known that the metropolitan, the highest ranking clergyman in the Russian Orthodox Church, was the member of the party. But in our village, there was among the invalids in that Polish home for invalids was a pop, a batyushka, which is a Russian priest. And he was a white Russian from the Polish territories who was arrested as a priest and put in prison and so on and so on. And finally, when he was let out of prison, he arrived at the Polish embassy in Kujbyszew, and he lived in their dormitory. They had a dormitory there for all those people who were coming. And he started running around the city, baptizing children and saying private masses and so on, and sure enough, he was arrested again. And this time the embassy asked about him, and no, the answer from the equivalent of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was they don't know anything about the priest. All of a sudden, one day, after several months, he showed up at the embassy with sallow cheeks, and obviously let out of the prison after torturing. He was telling the people in the embassy that they grabbed him by the beard and was hitting his head against the wall and so on. Well, to the embassy, the important thing was that they released him from prison, which immediately meant that he became an informer. Consequently, the embassy didn't want to have him around, and they sent him to the home for Polish invalids and old people. So he arrived, and he was warned immediately by my uncle, who was the director, not to run around the villages and perform any religious services. He said yes, he suffered enough, and so on, and the week didn't go by when he already started making contacts, and everybody knew that he was in this village, in that home, and so on and so on. Well, it was after the Battle of Stalingrad, around maybe 1943-44, when the government decided that they should open some churches and permit people to pray, to give them some relief. And I was witnessing a conversation between an NKVD officer and this particular priest. That was already toward the end of our stay there, and I was previously put in charge of registration of the Polish exiles, because I was the only one who could write and read in Russian. So I was called by that regional NKVD officer to see him in the mayor's office. And as I came, the priest was there already, obviously, giving a report on what's happening in the village. So I sat down and waited, and I heard the conversation between the officer and the priest. And the officer says to the priest, he says, "Listen, old man, when are you going to open the church in such and such place?" And the priest says, "Well," he says, "I am not planning to, because I am going home to my family." He says, "Never mind your family," the officer says. "We will bring them here, but you have to open the church. You must to do it, because they are bothering me from the district." So the priest still started, playing the game, says, "Well, that church that's used now as a warehouse. There is grain there." And the NKVD man says, "There is no grain. I told them to clean it up, and I checked it. It's all empty, and the walls are whitewashed, and it's ready to be used as a church. I'll get you the vestments and everything. You just take it over," and no other words spoken. And that was it. The government ordered the church to be open. Period. After the diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile were broken at the end of April 1943, the Soviet government decided to force Soviet citizenship on all of the Polish exiles. The idea being, obviously, that after the war, if the Polish government says, "Well, what about our citizens in the Soviet Union?" The Soviet government would say, "Well, there are no Polish citizens in the Soviet Union. Everybody has a Soviet passport." So they started forcing these passports on people, the citizenship, and trying to coerce them and convince them. And most of the people took the citizenship because they were threatened with being sent back to prison camps. And many people were sent, those who refused. Others simply accepted the passport. Myself and my family, we refused the passports. We were imprisoned for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And then, just as unexpectedly as we were imprisoned, we were released without passports. The reason for it, we didn't know. We suspected that our working in the home, which was an agency, let's say, of the Polish embassy, made the authorities think that maybe we had some rather close connections with the embassy without having diplomatic status.